that's an easy one. Definitely yes. And I think it was the first time I traveled outside Europe, because for me, Europe is about a number of values and a particular culture. And of course, when you're living in that culture, you don't really notice it. You know, you're like a fish swimming in water. And so for me, when I was 18, I went to India, and obviously that was a very different culture. But to be honest, it was meeting Americans that made me realize I was a European, because although I met a lot of people from all sorts of different countries across the world, and although it was very easy to speak with the Americans because we had the same language, I felt much more affinity with other Europeans. Even if I struggled to find the language, culturally we were so similar. And it really struck me then that, you know, there is a unity across our continent, and we do share values and a cultural outlook. Obviously that was before we joined up with Eastern Europe, but for me that was a sort of quite a shocking recognition, actually, because I'd always assumed that there was an affinity with the US, but that was maybe just something because of watching films and TV. But when I actually met people outside my own culture, it was very clear that I was a European, and that French, Spanish, German, whatever, they were Europeans too. 57. So Europe has extended its boundaries, I would say, quite a lot since I went to school, for example, or since I first started thinking about these things. And I can remember as well when the wall came down and when it was the end of communism. You know, of course, I can remember that very well. My children were small then. It was an enormous relief, really, more than anything else. What Europe is and what it means has changed a lot during my lifetime. And I hope what we're doing is taking the core of what's really precious about European values and just extending those outwards. When I feel optimistic about Europe, that's what I think is happening. I think that's a fairly easy one for me, because I think it was the Brexit vote. I think I see that as part of an attack on the European Union, and an attack on European values, and an attack on democratic values, which are at the heart of what makes Europe what it is. And, you know, I was very active in the campaign in 2016. It was very clear to me that people were deliberately lying, that there was all sorts of manipulation and distortion and deliberate attempts to use propaganda, lies, and dirty money, really, to change the way a country thought about itself and its place in the world. And that was frightening and very sadly successful. And I think Brexit is still a threat to how I conceive of Europe. And obviously, I've fought it the whole way, and it's happened now, which is a great sadness. But I think my job now is to preserve European values in the UK and prepare the ground for us to return as EU members at some point. Essentially, people that wanted to attack, in this case, the European Union, but, you know, the European Union that's holding the European project there with high standards and good protections for citizens, and, you know, basically softening globalized capitalism in a way that's good for citizens but not good for oligarchs, let's say. There's certainly people that are threatened by that project, and they looked across Europe and they said, oh, look, there's a country where we can actually pull off a coup against Europe. And sadly, that was my country. But anyway, I'm glad at least that other Europeans recognize that. And I hope they're aware that it's basically something that's been done to us. Most people in this country didn't understand what was happening, were lied to, and are victims of Brexit, really. And that will become clearer over the next few years. My best moment is kind of also a worst moment, but what always makes me feel powerfully European is when one European country is attacked and the other comes in to stand alongside. And that happened for me very powerfully when I was a member of the European Parliament, and the Charlie Hebdo attack took place. And obviously it was a terrible attack, but what impressed me so much was the way, because France was under attack, Germany has to come in and stand alongside. It's that Franco-German connection at the heart of Europe is so strong and so well understood. And each leader of France and Germany, they continue to do that. And obviously all the other European countries are important as well. But I value the European Union because it's a peace project, because my children haven't had to fight a war in Europe. My generation hasn't had to fight a war in Europe. that's what the European Union was founded for, and it's been tremendously successful. And right at the heart of that, I mean, obviously as Brits, we've got the channel, we think it's not going to happen here, so we don't feel as tied into that really. We should, but we don't. But as long as France and Germany know that, and as long as they keep it strong, we are holding the peace in our continent for the first time in hundreds of years. It's a huge achievement. And so to me, when I see France and Germany understanding that and performing that role, for me, that's a hugely powerful thing every time. So if it weren't for the EU, I wouldn't have had the opportunity to actually be an elected politician and exercise power on behalf of British people to make legislative change. And because we have a very bad democracy in the UK, not really a democracy at all, it's almost impossible for Greens to become elected to our parliament. And our parliament doesn't give you the power to change laws. In the same way that I could as an MEP. The British Parliament is like is owned by the government. The government decides what happens. So in two ways, Greens are immensely more powerful in a European context. And I really value that opportunity. And I did make some real change. And in spite of Brexit and in spite of kind of being kicked out at the beginning of my second term, I will never forget the opportunity I had to use power as a politician. It was an amazing thing for me, and I hope of benefit to British people and Europeans more widely as well. Obviously, climate change is right at the top of my agenda in terms of policy, but I think everything else we're trying to achieve will fail unless the European Union stabilizes itself as a democratic project and stabilizes the democracies within Europe. So personally, I wish that there'd been more effort to protect the UK as a democracy, both before, during and after the Brexit vote, because our democracy is very rocky now. But this applies as well in Italy. It applies to the countries of Eastern Europe. I don't think it's been enough of a priority for the European leaders. They've understood that it's a peace project. They're focused on the single market, but they haven't understood that democracy itself is under attack, and they need to show more leadership, challenging attacks on the rule of law in Poland and Hungary, really supporting those of us in the UK who are trying to defend democracy and be good Europeans, trying to support democratic forces right across the Union. I think people have just not understood the extent and seriousness of that threat, and they need to do that by 2030, because otherwise the whole of the EU is really at risk, I think. Well, when I was at school, Europe was quite a small number of countries, actually, in terms of the European Union. And we went on holiday to various of those countries, and I went on exchanges and so on. But I always valued different European cultures. I mean, it's an amazing, wonderful, diverse continent we've got. But I was always actually quite hostile to the European Union. I think in just an unthinking kind of British way, there was and there has continued to be just a sort of lazy, misguided understanding about what the European Union is about, which we can get away with because we feel we're a little bit distant from it. It hasn't got the same sort of visceral need to be part of Europe that countries who had real catastrophes in the Second World War felt. We won the war. It was good. The Second World War was a good thing for many Brits, and we perceived Europe in a completely different way because of that. And even though I studied politics, even though I considered myself quite well informed, I just accepted a lot of the sort of lazy untruths about the European Union that are repeated endlessly in the UK and have been for decades. And also, I didn't. As a Green, I was suspicious of the power of corporations within the European Union. And I also shared that with most people in my party, because the Green Party in the UK was anti-European, anti-EU anyway, until about 15 years ago. But essentially what evolved for us was that we saw, partly because Greens were elected to the EU Parliament, they were in the institutions, getting action on plastic or pesticides or issues that were really at the heart of our politics, Greens were very effective at improving laws and improving the way the single market worked. And we realized actually this is a platform to challenge the power of corporations. It's not that, I mean, corporations are obviously far too powerful in the Brussels lobby, but as Greens, I've seen how other Greens have managed to really challenge that power and improve things for citizens. And so I think over time, my view shifted, and I was really in parallel with my party over that, seeing the EU as a force for good and a place where citizens could have power. And obviously, once I became elected as an MEP, I could put that into practice more, and also learn much more about how embarrassingly ignorant I was really about how European policy making worked. So yeah, I wasn't always a huge Euro enthusiast, but it's also true, of course, following Joni Mitchell, that you don't know what you've got till it's gone. And I think the Brexit referendum really crystallized that for me. You know, I've been a sturdy opponent of Brexit, and I will continue to campaign for us to rejoin the EU when that's appropriate politically. Yeah, well, I studied PPE, politics, philosophy, and economics at Oxford University, and that's the kind of classic thing to study if you're going to move into politics. But I dropped economics very quickly because the way it's taught in universities is just like completely theoretical and abstract, and I just didn't see the point of it. And then, you know, I went off, worked, had children, and got involved in the Green Party. And after some years campaigning against various threats to my children really and to our environment, I started realizing that all these threats had an origin in the way the economy is organized. And so it felt to me like it would be more efficient to go off and study economics and work out how the economy worked and how we could change it. So then I did a PhD, and yeah, I've studied and taught and written about economics since then. So to me, it's like, it's a kind of efficient way of solving the other problems that have always been of concern to me, not just environmental problems, but also, you know, social justice, inequality, sort of outrageous poverty that we have in all our societies. Trying to understand how that happened was all about understanding the economy. I'm the MEP that refused to fly, so yeah, I mean, obviously I'm on track there. I only flew once in my mandate to Latin America. So I always traveled everywhere by train. I traveled to Moscow by train. I've traveled to south of Spain by train. Went to Gibraltar twice by train. So yeah, I don't think there should be domestic flights within Europe. Okay, if you have like the Republic of Ireland, I mean, I've been there lots of times by ferry, so maybe you can make an exception for that. But to me, night trains, which are now, I'm really delighted to see making a comeback, are the answer to this. The train tracks are there. You can get on the train and, you know, wake up the other side of Europe. So it's very hard in a climate emergency to justify any flights within Europe, in my view. Yes, I do. There's no way we're going to tackle a crisis of this urgency and this magnitude without significant government action. You know, we need everybody to be involved. So we do need businesses to be involved, but we need the frameworks and the incentives to be created by policymakers and by governments to push business in the right direction. And that's something I was able to work on from the finance side as an MEP. And then we need to create the right incentives for citizens to do the right thing as well. So we need night trains so that you can move across Europe without having to fly. We need good quality public transport that people can afford to use. We need to make sure that the thing that you need to do for environmental reasons and for climate reasons is the cheapest and easiest thing to do, and only governments can do that. So yeah, I think I'm somebody who spent 30 years trying to do the right thing from a green point of view, and I can tell you how difficult it is. And it's so much more efficient and easier for everybody if government creates the right sort of incentives. And so yeah, I'm We need big government action. We need urgent government action. And the encouraging thing we've learned from the COVID crisis is that when there's an emergency, governments can act incredibly fast and they can find the money to do extraordinary things very quickly. And we just need them to apply all of that to the climate crisis. I think the jury is out on this question. It's clear that some of the people who were driving Brexit were climate deniers and people who wanted to tear up red tape protecting the environment and protecting our climate. But more recently, we've seen suggestions from the Prime Minister and from the government, at least rhetorically, that they want more urgent action on climate change. So I'll be convinced when they start introducing the right policies. For example, we had a policy of a carbon price floor, which was like a minimum price for carbon. The Tories reversed that. Now, if they increase a serious trajectory for increasing the price of using fossil fuels, then I'll believe they're serious about climate action. And similarly, you know, we're still seeing the expansion of aviation. When they start shutting airports and having a frequent flyer levy, then I'll believe they're serious. So it's not as bad as I feared, at least not yet, because we're not seeing the government ripping up the Climate Change Act, abandoning pre-existing targets, or saying it's going to diverge from the targets that we were required to follow as EU members. But it's still early days, and although we're seeing rhetorical commitment to climate action, we're not seeing anything like the sort of serious policies or serious investments that we need. So I think it's still too early to answer your question. Oh, this is such an important question. And I really think about this a lot. I think there is a way in which we'll continue to be connected, because assuming we don't just drift off and become some kind of North Korea in the North Atlantic kind of thing, we are going to still trade. We are going to have to stick to some of the same laws. We're going to have all those energy relationships as well with the interconnectors. And so we are in Europe. We'll continue to have economic and business relationships. We'll have business associations outside the remit of the European Union with other European countries. So I can see all sorts of economic connections that will inevitably continue. And this is another reason why ultimately it will be seen to be absurd that we're not EU members, because we'll be following those laws, we'll be keeping in the same sort of networks and so on, but we'll be somehow outside. So ultimately Brexit is going to be seen to be complete nonsense. But I think, to me, what's much more concerning is what happens on a personal level. And, you know, I can just about remember before we were members of the European Union, and we had a really active system of twinning. And, you know, we had 3 twin towns. I grew up in Bath, and we had 3 twin towns, and I visited them all, either with my school or with the guides. And there was a sort of deliberate attempt by lots of organizations to make sure that as a young person, I visited different European countries. And all of that's gone, because we didn't need that when we were in the EU. We automatically had connections and had visits and exchanges. And so I'm going to continue to lobby very strongly that we keep the Erasmus Plus scheme in the UK. I don't see any reason why that should be impossible if the government commits to it. And that is a very important way of making sure young people continue to travel across Europe. But I think we also have to rebuild those deliberate connections, you know, the deliberate making of connections through twinning, through actual associations between certain cities and so on. We're just going to have to rebuild that structure. And I'm working with the European movement now, and this is definitely one of the things that we're focused on, not only because we don't want to be isolated from the continent we're a part of, but also because I genuinely believe we will need to rejoin the European Union, and younger people will want to rejoin, and we need to keep those diplomatic channels open and those relationships close so that will be easier when the time comes.